I'm wondering about the role of anxiety in all of this. The reason I ask about anxiety is that you said that so much of character structure is determined by a set of predispositions and potentialities.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier we were talking about the example of either being afraid or unafraid in particular environments, or feeling like we can walk into a classroom and learn, or whether or not we're overly concerned about what people think about us, or both, right? It could be a mix. Whether or not we can embrace novel environments in safe and adaptive ways, whether or not we can grow from them, as opposed to whether or not we can be overtaken by them or perhaps even injured, harmed psychologically, physically, or both. Anxiety to me is a very basic function. I think about it in terms of the autonomic nervous system and degrees of excitability and et cetera, an ability to sleep at night, an ability to wake up feeling reasonably good but not have a panic attack. But anxiety to me does seem like a key node in all of this, meaning, most people, including myself, I don't walk around thinking about my character structure. I don't walk around thinking about how I'm going to behave in a bunch of hypothetical environments. I think about the fact that most mornings I wake up and I feel pretty good, to be quite honest, not as good as I would like to feel. And not necessarily because anything's wrong, but because I think I'm wired to be a little bit more on the anxious side and to predict what's going to happen next and what needs to be done. And so until I'm actually engaging in certain behaviors, that anxiety hums a little bit high for me. The gears turn a little bit faster perhaps than I would like when I wake up in the morning. But once I engage, I feel like the speed of that gear turning matches the demands of life pretty well. And I feel agency. Okay. So if you don't mind, could we explore this feeling of anxiety or lack of anxiety that I think people are pretty familiar with within themselves at different times of day and under different conditions? Because to me, it seems like an interesting lens to explore this notion of character structure and defenses. Is anxiety a healthy defense or an unhealthy defense, or does it simply depend on the circumstances?
Well, we all have some degree of anxiety in us, right? We all have some awareness that like we're navigating the world and like not everything is perfect, right? This is not nirvana. So there's some anxiety within us. And the thought is that anxiety can keep us vigilant about the things we should be vigilant about, health and safety, right? But that too much anxiety then becomes counterproductive. And we can look at this in a very regimented way, right? So some anxiety makes sense, right? It keeps us being careful. It keeps you being careful as you're pulling out of a driveway, for example, right? So, okay, it can be absolutely fine. But let's say you bring something to clinical attention that isn't absolutely fine, right? Let's say I didn't know you and you come in. We have the example that you used before, where you walk into work and there's a group of people that you know well and like, right? Let's say you told me, when I walk in there, I feel very anxious, right? I don't feel like things are okay, right? So then we would go through it. We said, that's not good, right? Maybe it's impacting your professional life. Things are not going well. Like you really want this to change because it's impacting your life in a negative way. And we say, okay, let's look at that from the perspective of structure of self, right? So first, unconscious, right? Is it that just genetically are you built with just higher levels of anxiety, right? So we could learn, okay, have you always been anxious like this? Has this always been in your life since you were a little kid, no matter what? So we're looking for biological, nature, so to speak, variables. We might also look for things that have happened to you that are lodged in your unconscious mind, right? Is there trauma that you haven't processed, right? That now is underneath the surface, but is spinning off more anxiety, right? Let's say you tell me, oh, it wasn't that long ago you started being anxious. Like did something happen? Like, did you walk into a group of people and I don't know, you tripped and you felt bad about something, right? And then you get more anxious, right? So are there things going on underneath the surface that are impacting you? Like, let's look into that, right? Because that's the biggest part of the iceberg, right? Then your conscious mind, we could start thinking about, okay, what's going on? What are you actively thinking about, right? So this is where sometimes cognitive behavioral techniques can come into mind. Like, are you thinking like, oh no, I'm scared, it isn't gonna go well, right? Like, are you having thoughts? Are the thoughts then making you more anxious, right? What's going on in your conscious mind, right? I would also be very interested in the defenses around you. So for example, do you tend to avoid, right? Has this been getting worse for 3 months, but you just your mind wouldn't acknowledge it, right? And by the time you have to acknowledge it, now it's really bad, right? Or do you not avoid and like this just started happening and you want to nip it in the bud, right? So I would be interested in the defense mechanisms, right, that are girding your conscious self. And I would be interested in the character structure. What decisions are you then making? Like, are you going anyway? Right? Are you having trouble so sometimes you avoid? Are you then making decisions that make you late and that causes problems? How does it impact you once you're there? Are you engaging differently with people, doing your work differently? So I want to understand the character structure, and ultimately you understand all of this by probing the self that's riding along on top of it. And then what is the experience of that self? Like, do you see that, okay, this is a problem and I want to address it, but like, look, I know that I'm good at what I do. And, I mean, this isn't some like awful thing about me. I just have to deal with it, right? Or is your self impacted where you start thinking, maybe I can't do this anymore. I'm not good enough. Or, we want to understand what's the experience of the self, right? And if we do all of that, how is it that we don't get to a place where we can understand that anxiety, right? And we can make things better. So just like in physical health, okay, maybe we can't, but that is a dramatic outlier. If we bring ourselves to bear, we would say, you should not have to have this in you, right? Because it is something negative. It is making unhappiness for you. It is taking away from empowerment, right? And it's also taking away from humility, right? Because if someone's beating up on themselves, you're beating up on yourself about it, then that's not humility, right? Then that's being sort of falsely persecutory, right? It's not an honest humility to that. It leads us away from health. So it's like, we don't want it to be this way, right? Because that is working against agency and gratitude. So we can understand it and we can go after it and make it better.
One of the most common questions I get on the internet, and I get a lot of questions, is what can be done to improve confidence?
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought a lot about that question and what is confidence? In the context of what we're talking about now, is one reasonable definition of confidence our ability to trust our predispositions and our potentialities enough that were we to encounter scenarios A through Z, we feel pretty good that we would respond the right way, in a way that wouldn't threaten our conscious mind at a core level, right? That we wouldn't, I used to use the term and joke a lot in my laboratory with the phrase, dissolve into a puddle of our own tears, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of this like hyperbolic explanation of what I think many people fear, like they're going to be called upon to answer a question publicly or give a speech, or they're going to be at a critical moment in a relationship or something, and just everything is just going to go so badly wrong that it's just going to dissolve them as a person. It's impossible, right? Dissolving a puddle of our own tears is impossible, but I think that's a fear that a lot of people live with, because we can get into this a little bit later, and we will, I'm sure, this notion of like protecting one's ego it seems really vital to being a human being at some level. Like we don't want to dissolve into a puddle of our own tears. So is confidence the ability to trust ourselves in a bunch of different contexts? And at the same time, I do have to raise this notion of narcissism. I think, this word gets thrown around a lot lately, but it seems to me that any truly psychologically healthy person would also not want to be the idiot that thinks that they're better than they actually are. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with the things that you said about confidence, except I would add two factors that I think are like really big factors, right? One being state dependence and the other being phenomenology, right? So think about the state dependence first, right? When we're talking about confidence, it's not uniform, right? Or it's not automatically uniform, right? So if you were to tell me, oh, I lack confidence, right? Then I want to understand, is that across the board? Is that a way that you feel about yourself? That like, I'm not good enough at anything, for example, right? Or do you lack confidence in a specific area, right? And this is often the case, right? And it's a huge difference, right? It says that person has the machinery of confidence, so to speak, right? They have the potentialities and the predispositions for confidence, right? When that character structure, the self built upon it, is engaging with the world, right? But they're not able to bring it to bear in a certain special situation, so to speak. So for some people, for example, the way we most often see this is like the carve out of romance, right? Where because it's so emotionally laden, right? And like rejection can feel so bad, right? That we can see people who are very confident in many, many aspects of life, but they are very diffident about romance. And they'll say diffident, oh, it never works out for me, or no one will ever like me, right? And you see, like, that's not how that person actually feels, right? About themselves as a whole human being, right? Which is then we are coming at how to make that better in a way that's very robust, right? We might say something like, hey, here's the good news is you have the tools and the machinery that you need, right? You're confident in so many ways, right? In fact, maybe in all ways except this one. So let's go take a look at like, why is that special? Right? Where are we? We're back to, is it something in the unconscious mind? Is it something in the conscious mind about how that person is engaging, right? So we have to understand what the state is and if the lack of confidence is state dependent. If the person is not confident across the board, then again, we go back to the same, you always go back to the same places to look, right? But then you might more think, okay, is there an impact of childhood trauma or early life trauma that took away from that person, their ability to gain confidence, right? Because if you have no confidence across the board, there's a deeper problem, right? Because there would be something anyone can be good at and feel confident in, right? So the state dependence is very important, as is phenomenology. So what is your experience of being confident? If you tell me, well, let's say in a different version of this example, you say, actually, I feel quite confident when I walk into a room of people. I say, okay, I want to understand more about that too, right? Because if I ask questions about that and you say, well, I feel confident because, look, I'm a pretty smart person. I can think on my feet. I can deal well with people. If something doesn't go right, I can recover from it. Like I've got, that's why I feel confident, and say, okay, that sounds pretty good. If you say, well, I feel confident because I know that I'm better than everybody, right? Now we have a problem, right? Right? Like that's not going to go well in other aspects of life and engagement. Like there's, it's not going to lead to humility and gratitude. Like so where's that coming from? And again, maybe there's a deeper problem, right? As you said about narcissism, right? Which can be a reaction, right? Which is a reaction to vulnerability, right? So then there's what's called a reaction formation, and now the person is actually deeply diffident, right? But presents as very, very confident and with a sense of superiority. And that's not a recipe for happiness, right? So in approaching it, we do want to understand all the things that you said. What are the factors and the set of predispositions and the set of potentialities? But then what's the real world experience of that across situations? And what is the person's experience of that inside? Which is why if we're going to understand and help people, like that's the understand part, right? It's why the conveyor belt medicine, it doesn't work, right? In situations where we're dealing with human beings, like mental health, right? We have to understand something about people to understand whatever they're telling us means. Otherwise, you have no context, so you have no knowledge.